Will you be taking a Checkride sometime in the future? If so, you'll want to know about all of the changes the FAA has just made to many ACS documents, and they all become effective in just a day or two. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 329, we talked about the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024 and how it impacts GA pilots. And in episode 330, we had a Friday mailbag special in which we read a number of your listener stories and emails. So if you didn't hear those episodes, you may want to check them out at aviationnewstalk.com/329 and /330. And if you're new to the show, welcome. So happy to have you here. Glad you found us. Now, if you would take a moment right now, touch either the subscribe key or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And since this is a listener-supported show, I'll be telling you later about all the different ways you can support our work here. And when you support the show, I'll read your name on the show. Coming up in the news for the week of May 27th, 2024, FAA proposes a fine against the company which owned a Caravan that crashed in Burley, Idaho. Skydivers exiting a Cessna 206 caused it to crash. And we'll tell you about a study on the impact of using a home simulator on pilot training. All this and more, and the news starts now. From FAA.gov, FAA proposes a $239,000 civil penalty against Jemair of Salmon, Idaho, for allegedly violating aircraft maintenance and flight planning restrictions. And I'll tell you more about that in a moment, but it's related to this story from flymag.com. NTSB says pilot was flying too low before hitting smokestack in Idaho. The NTSB released its final report into the fatal April 2022 accident that occurred when the pilot on approach to Burley Municipal Airport crashed into a smokestack. Now, we talked about that accident in detail in episode 233, and the accident pilot's father has been in touch with me a number of times since then. My heart goes out to the family and him over the loss of their daughter in that crash. Continuing with the story from Flying Magazine, the aircraft collided with an exhaust stack that lies directly beneath the extended centerline of runway 20. The accident happened shortly after 8:30 a.m. when it was snowing and IFR conditions prevailed. According to the NTSB, the aircraft struck an agglomerate stack that measures 32 inches in diameter. Just beyond it was a group of 6 exhaust stacks. The smokestack, which is used to collect particulate emissions from the manufacturing process, is 100 feet above ground level. FAA had been advised of the stacks as a potential hazard to aircraft in 2016 and had been working with the plant owner on mitigation measures. Those measures included decommissioning of the airport VASI, painting the exhaust stacks white and aviation orange to make them more visible, and adding an obstruction lighting on the tallest stack. However, photographs of the stacks provided to the NTSB reveal no such paint scheme. And in one of the more bizarre aspects of this accident investigation, the NTSB could not determine if the obstruction light on the tallest exhaust stack was functioning at the time of the accident, as it was allegedly stolen from the scene by an individual who was not part of the official investigation. According to the NTSB report, this individual later appeared in a YouTube video with the light and discussed its use during the accident sequence. The video was shot in the individual's home office several states away. The local police department investigated the theft, which included reviewing the YouTube video. A copy of the YouTube video has been included in the public documents of the NTSB report. The NTSB states that the YouTube individual later recanted his statements, saying the light he appeared on the camera with was not from the crash site. At the time of the accident, the Caravan pilot held a commercial certificate, had approximately 1,400 hours total time, and had been flying for less than 6 months for Jemair LLC. Probable cause: the pilot's failure to maintain altitude during an instrument approach, which resulted in a descent below the approach path and impact with the vent stack. Also causal was the failure of the processing plant to correctly paint the vent stacks, which had been determined by the FAA to be a hazard to navigation due to their proximity to the landing approach path. Contributing to the accident was the likely distraction/illusion/obscuration created by steam from the processing plant, which intermittently obscured the runway. Now, continuing with our original story, the FAA alleges that Jemair operated a Cessna Caravan on 315 flights between May 2nd and November 28th of 2022, when a required engine haul was overdue. Also, operating a Cessna T-206 on a series of flights on August 8, 2022, when a required engine exhaust inspection was overdue, and operated a Britten-Norman BN-2A from Boise, Idaho to Salmon, Idaho, without enough fuel to complete the flight. The pilot made an emergency landing in Salmon after the plane's right engine stopped operating. The FAA alleges these operations were careless and reckless and endangered lives and property. GemAir has 30 days after receiving the FAA's enforcement letter to respond to the agency. And from Yahoo.com, skydiver's parachute damages plane's tail, causing it to crash near Butler, Missouri. Now, this accident caught my attention a few days ago when the initial news stories said only that the pilot of a Cessna 206 successfully parachuted from a plane before it crashed, and that the 6 other people on board all survived. And now we know from this story that a skydiver's parachute deployed over the 206's tail, causing damage that sent the aircraft out of control and crashing into a field Saturday near the Butler, Missouri Municipal Airport. At the time of the crash, the plane was taking 6 people on a skydiving mission shortly before 1 p.m. During the jump, one of the parachutes deployed over the tail, damaging the horizontal stabilizer. The plane went out of control and the pilot bailed, safely deploying a parachute. The plane, a 1968 Cessna 206C, crashed into a hayfield east of the airport's runways. The skydivers and pilot were treated at the scene and released, and the plane was a total loss. And listener and Patreon supporter John Johnson wrote me about this accident and said, quote, "I noted the story reported on the pilot and 6 skydiver passengers in the Cessna 206. I have a few hours on a 206, and I'm pretty sure its capacity is 6. Is there an exception for a skydiving configuration, or might the pilot have some explaining to do?" And I wrote back that there's an STC that allows one to remove all the seats but the pilot's seat and put 6 lap belts on the floor for skydivers, so it is a legal configuration. And by the way, my only 2 skydives many years ago were in a Cessna 182 that had a pilot and 4 skydivers. And I'll talk more about another skydiving story after the news during my updates. From BBC.com, Brazil floods, hundreds of towns underwater. And this story is from a couple of weeks ago. It says at least 85 people died in the floods and about 150,000 have been displaced by their homes. The Brazilian Airlines Association said that the airport in Porto Alegre would remain closed until at least the end of the month, after a nearby river burst its banks and flooded the runway and key buildings. Photos show an airliner and numerous GA aircraft with water reaching up to just below the wings. And from paddleyourown.canoe.com, it's very strange, but this has happened yet again. A person has died after being sucked into the engine of a KLM Cityhopper regional jet at Amsterdam Airport. One person has been tragically killed after they were sucked into the engine of a Cityhopper Embraer regional jet on Wednesday. The accident occurred as KLM Flight 1341 was preparing to depart from the gate at around 2:25 p.m. It is not known whether the fatality involved an airport or airline employee or a passenger. In a statement, the Dutch Royal Military Police said it had opened an investigation after a person, quote, fell into a running aircraft engine. The airport also confirmed the incident, saying, quote, "Today there was a horrible incident where a person ended up in an airplane engine. Last June, a ground worker employed on behalf of Delta Airlines was ingested into the engine of a Delta-operated Airbus A319 at San Antonio as the plane was taxiing to the gate. It was later revealed that the employee had died by suicide." And on New Year's Eve on 2022, another U.S. airport ground worker was killed after being sucked into the engine of an Embraer ERJ-175 regional jet operated by Envoy Airlines on behalf of American Airlines at Montgomery Regional Airport in Alabama. An investigation concluded that the worker was ingested into the engine after getting too close after the plane had just pulled onto its stand. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pre-buy flight ends in serious injuries for pilot. According to the FAA inspector who responded to the accident near Monongahela, Pennsylvania, witnesses reported that the Aranca 7AC departed Ross River Airport, that's FWQ, in Monongahela, Pennsylvania, and was practicing touch-and-go takeoffs and landings when, after takeoff, the airplane pitched up sharply, then went straight down. The pilot, who was seriously injured in the crash, told investigators that he was in the process of purchasing the airplane when the accident occurred. On the day of the accident, he performed several takeoffs and landings at another airport before flying to FWQ to get fuel. He performed a few takeoffs and landings in the traffic pattern at FWQ and assumed that during the final takeoff, the airplane got too slow and stalled. A review of the pilot's logbooks revealed that he did not have any documented flight experience in the accident aircraft make and model. The seller of the airplane stated that the accident flight was the pilot's first flight in the accident airplane. The pilot's tailwheel endorsement was completed on April 20, 2022 in an American Champion 7 ECA Citabria. However, there was no documented flight time associated with the endorsement. Probable cause: the pilot's exceedance of the airplane's critical angle of attack during the initial climb, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall. From Fox11Online.com, NTSB releases final report on fatal gyroplane helicopter crash at EAA AirVenture. The pilot of a gyroplane involved in a mid-air collision at EAA AirVenture, July 29th, made a 360-degree turn into the path of a helicopter shortly before the two collided, sending both aircraft to the ground and killing 2 people in the helicopter. NTSB says the gyroplane was approaching the ultralight home-built rotorcraft runway from the south when it turned 360 degrees to the left. The helicopter was behind the gyroplane in the traffic pattern and also approaching the runway from the south. About 250 feet above the ground, the gyroplane hit the left side of the helicopter. 2 people who were in the helicopter were killed. The pilot told investigators his recollection of the events have been impaired by the head injuries he suffered in the crash. He has determined there was a call from ATC to make space for departing traffic. Since he could not hover, he did the 360-degree turn, which he believed was safer than other options. Quote, "As I neared completion of the 360-degree turn with the intent to rejoin the base leg, the regrettable mid-air collision occurred. Obviously, I do not recall seeing the other aircraft prior to the impact, and from my difficult review of the video, it does not appear that the gentleman in the helicopter behind me ever saw my aircraft make the 360-degree spacing turn." A passenger in the gyroplane gave this description: "While coming in to land at the ultralight grass runway, the pilot did what he referred to as an impressive tight left turn, though he did not know the reason for the left turn. The next thing he heard was a loud pop, and the gyroplane was going to the ground. The gyroplane came to rest, and his right leg was pinned under the pilot, who was unconscious." One witness called the pilot's turn odd. Quote, "An officer had asked me if anything stood out of the ordinary, and I truly had thought prior to the incident that the hard 360-degree turn by the gyrocopter in the pattern was odd. A go-around procedure is not to make a hard 360 in your current leg of the pattern, but rather to make another full pattern." Another person who was at the pilot briefing said 360-degree turns were addressed at the sessions. Quote, "During each daily pilot briefing, the same issue was brought up: problems with the autogyros. There were several incidents during each of the daily rotorcraft flyby sessions that caused requests for the autogyro pilot to comply with traffic pattern standards. The pilots were asked repeatedly to stop doing 360-degree turns and spirals while in the traffic pattern. They were also asked to stop slowing down as if to land on the grass runway, then unexpectedly climbing back up into the traffic pattern," she wrote. According to the reports, the pilot had given many rides in his aircraft, but this was the first event at which he gave rides in his gyroplane. The pilot said, in retrospect, due to the chaotic nature of flying at OSH during AirVenture, he would never consider doing it again. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pilot pre-flight misses screw in control yoke column. The pilot, who told investigators that he remembered only portions of the accident due to his injuries, said that during takeoff from a remote grass-covered site in Port Muller, Alaska, as the airplane accelerated, he recalled discovering that there was no elevator control when he moved the control yoke aft. The Cessna 182 hit terrain, sustaining substantial damage to the fuselage, wings, and vertical stabilizer. The next thing the pilot, who was seriously injured, remembered was being upside down on the airplane immediately after the accident. After the accident, a camp helper told the pilot that due to windy conditions the prior evening, he had placed a large screw through the hole in the control yoke column, but he had forgotten to tell him. Probable cause: the pilot's inadequate pre-flight inspection, which did not detect a screw in the control yoke column, and his failure to confirm flight control continuity before takeoff. In other news, from GeneralAviationNews.com, after a year-long search, the Reno Air Racing Association has found a new home for the National Championship Air Races starting in 2025, and it's Roswell, New Mexico. Meanwhile, planning continues for the 2024 Reno Air Show and the 60th anniversary celebration on October 4th through the 6th at Reno State Airport. From skiesmag.com, GAMA, the GA Manufacturers Association, published Q1 2024 GA aircraft shipment and billing report. The results for the first 3 months of 2024, compared to the same period last year, showed deliveries were flat for piston airplanes and piston helicopters, decreased for turboprops and turbine helicopters, and increased for business jets. Total aircraft billings were up 3.2% at $4.7 billion. And from DroneLife.com, Drone Up, one of the largest drone delivery companies in the U.S., will likely expand its operation as a direct result of the passage of the bill to reauthorize the FAA. Company's COO, Anthony Vitone, said, quote, "I think the authorization bill is probably one of the biggest things to help the advancement of drones into the national airspace, maybe even bigger than Part 107. And finally, from GeneralAviationNews.com, study confirms flight simulation benefits pilot training. A newly published study shows that students who use home flight simulation during their private pilot training receive their certificate with 5.5 fewer flight training hours than those who don't. The study was of more than 1,000 certificated pilots and air traffic controllers. Ricky Parker, an airline pilot and co-founder of Next Level XR, said, quote, "We have always known that enthusiast flight simulation impacts pilot training, but have never had a way to quantify it. This survey is a great first step to showing there is serious benefit from complementing aircraft training with structured or unstructured time in a home flight simulator." For the study, the Flight Simulation Association asked more than 1,000 pilots to report how many training hours it took to obtain their private pilot certificate. Respondents also provided background on their flight simulation habits. Analysis then compared the amount of flight training required for those who used home flight simulation during training and those who didn't. Results show that users of home flight simulation saved 5.5 hours of flight training by comparison to those who didn't. Mike Catalfamo, CFI and founder of Flight Sim Coach, a company helping pilots with home simulators receive one-on-one remote training from flight instructors, said these results show that non-certified devices can significantly reduce flight hours and make training more affordable. Flight Sim Expo takes place June 21 to 23, 2024 in Las Vegas. The event showcases how flight simulation can be used to better prepare students for check rides and keep experienced pilots proficient between flights. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And then we'll talk with DPE Jason Blair about the new ACS changes and how they'll affect your next check ride. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to Robert Shapiro. He writes, "I went to the Water Wings Seaplane School to complete my commercial airplane multi-engine C rating. With another rating comes another donation to Aviation News Talk." Thanks for that, Robert. I hope you get lots of new ratings. He says, "I want to credit Water Wings. They are an awesome school in Shelby County, Alabama, where I have now been a very satisfied customer 3 times and completed 3 ratings over the last 10 years. ATP helicopter, commercial single-engine seaplane, and commercial multi-engine seaplane." Congratulations to you, Robert. And congratulations to Tyler Stank. He says, "I started listening to your podcast a few months ago, and I'm really liking it. I'm just writing to let you know I passed my CFI check ride this week. I had that go-around song that you play at the end of every episode playing in my head as the examiner tried to get me to coach him through landing the airplane, acting as though he'd never done it before, and I nearly needed to do so twice. I've been flying for a bit over a decade, and I'm really looking forward to introducing people to this amazing hobby and joining the ranks of professional aviators myself." Well, Tyler, congratulations to you as well. And just want to give you a quick update. I'm headed down to Southern California this weekend, where I'll be spending the next 2 weeks at USC's engineering department, finishing up their aviation safety and security certificate. But you'll still hear me here as I've been working ahead, doing multiple interviews so that there will be new shows while I'm down there. And in the middle of those 2 weeks, I'll be flying with one of our mega supporters, Roy Williams, in his Vision Jet. So it'll be good to see him and get a break from the classroom. And by the way, if you were interested in flying with me in Palo Alto, it's going to have to be after June 17th. And speaking of which, if you're going to be in the San Francisco Bay Area this summer and want to do any mountain training in the nearby Sierra Nevada mountains, please contact me and we'll set that up for you. And here's an article I thought you might be interested in from medium.com from the FAA. It's also from a new video that they've done. It says that the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team, or USHST, a government industry safety advocacy group, issued a helicopter safety enhancement in 2018, calling on the helicopter community to increase simulator training. Not only do simulators help pilots navigate UIMC, now that's an NTSB term for unintended IMC, spatial disorientation and other risky weather-related conditions, they also help with better decision-making, loss of control, loss of tail rotor effectiveness, and vortex ring state conditions. Several of these situations occur simultaneously. The Rotorcraft Collective, a government industry group, recently published a video that retells the time flight instructor Terry Palmer met some pilots waiting for their helicopter to be serviced in Shreveport, Louisiana. While they waited, she offered UIMC instruction in her flight simulator. The pilots crashed in every scenario. These pilots had traveled to Shreveport under VFR. Clouds were minimal, and the pilots could see obstacles and terrain several miles ahead of their helicopter's flight path. After their UIMC training, the pilots were en route back to Boston when they encountered weather outside New York City. They landed their helicopter. They knew they lacked the expertise to push through thanks to the simulator training. One of the pilots called Palmer to tell her that she saved their lives. According to Palmer, they scheduled additional simulator training to improve their instrument proficiency. Good story, and yes, a key thing for helicopter pilots to remember is that when you start to encounter less than VFR conditions, just put it down. And that could be in a field, it could be next to a road. You've got all kinds of options that other aircraft pilots don't have, so make sure you take advantage of that. And here's an interesting story I came across from sfgate.com. It says, skydiving instructor at California site found guilty of fraud. The skydiving instructor who taught courses at the beleaguered Lodi Parachute Center in San Joaquin County has been found guilty of fraud and identity theft as part of a scheme tied to 2 deaths at the site. The 7-day trial in Sacramento outlined how, and they mentioned the gentleman's name, age 49, certified student tandem instructor is using a forged signature after his own license was revoked. He charged about $1,100 for the courses, which enabled instructors to take first-time jumpers into the sky. One of the instructors falsely certified by him, a 25-year-old Korean man, died while harnessed in tandem with a first-time 18-year-old jumper in August of 2016 after the Korean man was unable to successfully deploy either the main parachute nor the reserve. That tragedy resulted in a $40 million civil judgment against the center's former owner. Tyler's mom, Francine Turner, told SFGate last year that as of July 2023, none of that money has been paid. Now, the person in question was not charged with causing the death of those 2 people. However, the U.S. Attorney's Office said in a statement on Friday that this gentleman falsely told students that he was a tandem examiner and led them to believe they could obtain USPA and UPT tandem ratings through his courses. And that's referring to the U.S. Parachute Association and United Parachute Technologies. He accepted numerous students in this manner from around the world, including the Republic of Korea, Chile, and Mexico, according to the statement. To falsify the students' certifications, he used the digital image of the signature of another instructor who was out of the country. He now faces up to 20 years in prison for each count of wire fraud and a 2-year sentence for aggravated identity theft. Sentencing is set for August 26th. The Lodi Parachute Center has been the site of 28 fatalities since 1985. Alongside the $40 million 2021 civil judgment brought by the Turner family, the center was issued fines totaling $993,000 by the FAA in 2010 and 2011, and it was subject to an FBI raid in 2018. The center remains open today. And my quick little story related to the operations at that airport is that a number of years ago, I was doing an instrument flight, doing training with a client, and when we were announced that we were flying the instrument approach into Lodi Airport, someone on the ground came on the frequency to tell us essentially that we should go away and go to another airport because, quote, this is a working airport. So I did not argue with him that it's a public use airport, which means that anybody could use it. But anyway, I just want to pass that along. And if you're curious about certifications Here's a statement that comes from the United States Parachute Association from their USPA.org website. It says, who regulates skydiving? The FAA has a responsibility for regulating airspace usage in the U.S. Concerning skydiving activities, the FAA fulfills this responsibility by specifically regulating certain aspects of skydiving and by relying upon the self-regulation of the participants through the guidelines and recommendations published by USPA. The FAA's main responsibility is to provide for the safety of air traffic, as well as persons and property on the ground. The FAA does this by certifying pilots, mechanics, air traffic controllers, and parachute riggers, and by requiring approval data for aircraft and parachutes. The agency has the authority to impose fines and suspend or revoke certificates it has issued. In the case of a skydiving violation, the FAA can fine the pilot, rigger, and the jumpers, as well as suspend or revoke the certificates of pilots and riggers. And elsewhere, it says the FAA relies upon self-policing from the skydiving community for most training and operational requirements. And 65.113 says to be eligible for a parachute rigger certificate, a person must be 18 years of age, be able to read, write, and understand the English language, and some other things. And 65.119 gives the requirements for a master parachute rigger certificate, which includes at least 3 years of experience and satisfactorily having bagged at least 100 parachutes of each of two types in common use. Now, in terms of the skydivers themselves, the USPA issues 4 skydiving licenses. So you don't get those through the FAA, you get them through the USPA. And those licenses, A through D, indicate progressive levels of skill and accomplishment. Each level requires a certain number of jumps, skill tests, and an oral and a written exam. USPA licenses remain current with membership and are recognized by the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. A skydiver is considered a student until issued a license. And just some examples here. For a level A license, you must have completed 25 freefall jumps and a number of other requirements. And the top license, the level D, you must have completed 500 jumps, including accumulating at least 3 hours of controlled freefall time. And here's an email from Kenneth Solaski. We mentioned him last week as being a new mega supporter. He says, thanks, Max. Love the show. Your style and presentation are excellent. My flying work experience includes flying with the New York City Police Department, NYPD, retiring as a lieutenant and the chief pilot. I was the chief pilot during the September 11th terrorist attacks, a day we will never forget. I also served as the chief pilot for the Newark, New Jersey Police Department. Today, I'm proud to be an associate professor of aviation at the State University of New York in Farmingdale, teaching undergraduate aviation courses, and I'm the lead ground instructor at Nassau Flyers, a Platinum Cirrus partner located at the Farmingdale Republic Airport in New York. I absolutely love your podcasts. I learn something new every week. Your commitment to safety is both admirable and contagious. Thank you very much. He says, keep up the good work, helping to keep us all a little safer when flying. I'm proud to donate to the cause and would like it to be in memory of my dad, Edward Solaski, who was a World War II combat paratrooper, 101st Airborne, and a mechanic that spent over 40 years at Grumman Aerospace and was the inspiration to get me involved in flying. Well, Kenneth, thanks so much for sharing that. And we have a new mega supporter this week. Now, the mega supporters are the folks that donate $50 a month or more. And this one is anonymous, but he says, I loved your show with Chuck Kelly, talking about collecting data and displaying it on FlyStow to analyze landing performance. He says, I came across them at the CPPP event in Florida in March. The number one thing I learned was that planes don't crash on landings with a stable approach. I feel like that should be drilled into a new student's brain from day one. And yes, I thought that was really interesting. We all know that, yes, you can recover from some unstable approaches, but sometimes they lead to accidents. But it was interesting that there were no crashes associated with a stable approach out of the many thousands of landings that they analyzed. And let me also mention some of our one-time donations that came in through this week. This is a large donation from a gentleman who wishes to remain anonymous, and he made it via Zelle, which is great because that means 100% of it comes through. There are no fees that are charged against it as there are with other methods such as PayPal and Venmo and so on. He says, late payer, I have been listening to your show for over a year. I have 7,000 hours, CFII, multi-sea glider, 50 years of flying. Congratulations, that's great. No incidents or accidents, nor a perfect flight either. I want to be UMAX when I grow up. Finally came to terms with the concept that I will never be a perfect pilot. That understanding and your voice in my head has made me a better one. Great podcast, my favorite. And he says also, I donate to many things that are worthwhile. For me, it's a question of, do you want it to end? And if the answer is no, then you better start supporting it. Keep up the good work. Well, thank you, sir, for your very kind words and for supporting the show. And Aviation is a small community, so see if you know any of these people who've signed up in the last week to support the show. New Patreon members include Charles Rapollier, Anup Sharma, who has increased his pledge, Mac Apodaca, who's done the same thing, and Douglas First. We also have some one-time donations via PayPal, thanks to Robert Shapiro and to Jim Gosney. And finally, we have a new monthly donor via PayPal, and that's Brian at Arizona Aviation Services. I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a future show. And if you'd like to join the community of people who support the show, it's so easy to do. It's just going to take you a couple of minutes. In fact, why don't you stop what you're doing right now? Go out to aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links so you can support the show via PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, or Patreon. And of course, when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. And if you happen to be in the market for a new headset, well, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed, because when you do, they'll make a donation to the show, but only if you make your purchase by first starting with that link on our website, aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. Coming up next, our conversation with Jason Blair about the many changes in the ACS and how they'll affect your future check rides. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let me tell you a little about Jason Blair. Jason is an FAA DPE or designated pilot examiner who gives check rides to pilots, and he's also an active flight instructor. He writes for both Flying and Plane and Pilot magazines. He's the past executive director of NAFI, the National Association of Flight Instructors, and he's served on a number of industry committees. And he's also one of our supporters who supports the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now here's our conversation with Jason Blair. Jason, welcome to the show. So great to have you back here again.
Always good to be back on a good holiday weekend where, those of us who are in the aviation industry are starting to prepare, right? So we take our holiday weekend, that's time off to get caught up to go forward, right? At least that's what I'm doing as an examiner this weekend, Max. I love it. So good weekend, good to talk with you again, and hope everybody out there's having, or had by the time they listen to us, a really awesome Memorial Day weekend.
Well, and I guess part of what you're doing is working on changes that are occurred because of new ACSs. Tell us what the FAA has done in terms of converting PTSs to ACSs and updating ACSs and all that.
Sure, Max, and this is exactly what I'm doing this weekend, because as a DPE, one of the things I have to do is make sure the tests that I'm giving are in accordance with whatever the current ACS and or PTS documents are, which means all of us as examiners out here have some homework that we've had to do. We're going on about, getting close to 60 days since these final documents were out. And it is pretty much all of the ACSs and PTSs that were updated. A couple of them did convert over from PTS to ACS for the first time, like the initial CFI. That's a big one that a lot of people are going to be looking at. And some of the helicopter stuff went from PTS to ACS. A couple of them did not. One notable was the instrument airplane instructor stayed as a PTS, did not convert over to an ACS this time, but has a bunch of normalization changes in it that kind of align that document with what's in the instrument ACS, especially because hopefully those CFII candidates are going to be training their students using ACSs. If you happen to be somebody out there flying power lift, you've got a personal Harrier or an Osprey or something, you're going to have a new ACS. I don't think we're going to have a lot of those, but we are heading into time where some of the newer aircraft, the vertical lift capability aircraft, needed to have certification standards. So a lot of work was done to bring those new standards forward. So when those things are ready to go into our national airspace system, we have standards that we can test the pilots to. So a lot of changes in terms of the documents. The good news, not a lot of changes in terms of the content in them. And there's not a lot of new maneuvers. We didn't change standards in a lot of these. So basically how you've been training in the past is probably still going to work in the future here. As we go to May 31st, it becomes active. So this Friday is when we're going to have all of these kick in, and all the examiners are going to be testing to the new ACS and PTS documents. So not lots of changes in terms of maneuvers, but I will say there's some kind of across the board changes that were incorporated in them that I think are good for people to know about and might help them along the way as they think about how they're going to actually do that practical test. Max, you want me just to dive into a couple of them? Is that the best to go here?
Oh, sure. And let's talk with the big changes first. What are some of the most significant changes?
So I think the first really big one is that CFI became an ACS. Now, in the past, when we were testing people to PTS standards, an examiner, when they did a test, if they selected a task area, they had to select every item under that task area. So let's imagine I'd selected aeromedical factors. I'd have to test you on hyperventilation and hypoxia and oxygen use, and maybe, we go through the whole thing, scuba diving, right? So now, because we're an ACS, we get the option to test a knowledge, a skill, and a risk management area from each task that's under there. Now, some of the tasks do have notes that say thou shalt select, 2 or 3 items or all items, but most of them it's the standard PTS where we'll build you a scenario and we work through parts of it. So that's going to actually make the test much more scenario driven and not quite as rote and we'll call it droning on for every little minutia in each particular task. So I think that's the biggest change that we're going to see for most people. We do have one new maneuver that got added into the CFI. This is the only one. And the maneuver is called Demonstration of Flight Characteristics at Various Configurations and Airspeed. Sounds really long, right? So basically it's slow flight, a little slower, and we're going to be demonstrating gear up, gear down, flaps up, flaps down. It's a demonstration for the CFI candidate to show they can demonstrate the aircraft's performance at lowest possible maneuver without stalling, but on the edge of stall. So it's a little bit different than slow flight as we go through configuration changes, and they can show how to adjust for best glide, not best glide. And basically, it's an aerodynamic demonstration. So the examiner has the option on a CFI initial practical test to select either between task A, which is the traditional slow flight, or task B, our new one. So that's one that you may start seeing in the CFI Checkride. Another really big, interesting thing, and this is something that is in a lot of them, but we'll start with the CFI. We have language in there about the pre-flight lesson on a maneuver to be performed in flight. We have a very specific line in there that says previously developed lesson plans from the instructor applicant's library may be used. So we've had a lot of contention in the past about, well, does the applicant have to build all their own lesson plans? Could they show up with lesson plans from a commercially provided group and then modify them? We have an explicit piece of language in here that says, look, the examiner doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, or the instructor doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. The examiner has to let them use pre-developed lesson plans. Now, I'm going to tell you, make sure that you modify it. If you're showing up in a Cessna 172 and the pre-developed lesson plans you brought with her for a Piper Cherokee, that's certainly not going to work. But it does give you the ability as a CFI candidate to build from a base and work with well-established long-term products and show up at the Checkride that way. So, which I actually think is a really good change, right? I mean, we're brand new instructors. None of us are superb in our first days. We're trying to do the best. It's good to leverage good long-term quality content that's out there. Just make sure you modify it and use it for what your current situation is going to be. Another piece there is that in all of the practical tests, we have language now that allows, it says presentation, preparation, and explanation of computer-generated flight plan is an acceptable option. So we've also got similar language, and I'm going to jump up to another one here that basically says the applicant is allowed to use EFB type flight planning. So historically, we very much focused on you're going to bring paper for charts and paper for a nav log, and you're going to show the examiner how to do that. We now have language in all of our ACSs and PTSs that basically has the examiner allow the individual to use EFB, electronic flight bag displays, for flight portions of planning and during the test. Now, that doesn't mean the examiner isn't going to ask, hey, what happens if your battery dies, right? So you can do all your planning in there and make sure you understand what's going on, but also understand you have some backup plans available. Might be an extra device, might be an iPhone to go with your iPad. It might be a charger, might be battery, something to give you the option when we go into that risk management and mitigation of things going wrong, how you're going to manage that along the way. So good change in all of the ACSs and PTSs to modernize us up to allowing digital flight planning in the system. So those are two really big ones as we look in that kind of go all the way through these. And if we dig into some of the instrument stuff, I think we've got some cool stuff here. In all of our instrument-based practical tests, we made a change that allows for the applicant, when flying a precision like approach for demonstration purposes. So our old language said that, we could use an LPV approach to demonstrate the precision approach, an approach with vertical guidance, as long as that approach went down to 300 feet above touchdown or lower. The language in the new CFII PTS and the instrument ACS allows the applicant to accomplish a precision approach. So we have one precision we've got to do in those to a decision altitude using the aircraft navigational equipment, centerline, vertical, and horizontal course guidance, as long as that approach has a decision altitude published. So this actually opens up beyond just the LPV and beyond approaches that only went down to 300 feet. So if we had an LNAV, VNAV approach or an LPV approach that had a decision altitude published, the applicant can use that on their practical test, or the examiner could ask them to do that, even if the height's maybe 800 feet above touchdown, right? As long as there's a decision altitude. This opens up the options on a practical test to not just need to shoot an ILS. We can have some other types of approaches, and certainly in some places around the country, it was hard to find, an ILS that you could get. Maybe you had a really busy airspace, or your nearest ILS was 200 miles away. If we had somewhere where the ILS was down and broken, and we had people flying a long ways just to try and finish the check ride, this gives the examiner some other options to try and get that precision approach done on the test. Now, I want to bring up one other piece, Max, here. In both the instrument and the double I, the old ones had a piece of language in there that said if the check ride is being done with a GPS system, that the instrument, as long as it's instrument certified, right, a GPS equipment that must be instrument certified and contain a current database. There's been a little confusion in some spots. Right now, the new language doesn't have that statement that says the applicant must have a current database. Okay, that doesn't get you out of jail free on this one. Now, the reason I say that is the ACS and PTS don't say it. However, the guidance to the FAA inspectors, which is also what examiners use, we have an FAA Order 8900, Volume 5, Chapter 2, Section 9, for anybody who wants to go super dork on this, says GPS equipment must be instrument certified and contain the current database if installed. So while the PTS and ACS don't say this, the guidance to the examiners says if you're going to fly an instrument approach on a check ride, we have to have a current database. So just because it's not in the ACS anymore, it is referenced in a different place. So don't think you're going to show up without having a current database. Now, what you can do now, though, is avoid having to fly a DME ARC. So in the previous ACSs and PTSs, we still had DME ARCs in there, and actually in the CFII, it was still questionably there as a must test item. Well, there's not a lot of DME ARCs left out there, and people are having to fly a long ways to get them. In the worst of cases, examiners were making up their own DME ARCs and saying, hey, fly me a 10-mile ring around something that isn't published. We have language in all of these now. The examiner may not select DME ARCs as a task unless they are charted and available. So we are not going to get the make up my own DME ARC thing on your check ride anymore. Now, it doesn't mean you won't get tested on the ground. Doesn't mean if you happen to have one at your nearby airport that they won't ask you to do it, but it is something that will not be added on if we can't reasonably do a truly published DME ARC. So a good little piece there to kind of think of. A couple more instrument things to kind of highlight. I guess one more instrument thing to highlight here. They broke this out pretty carefully. When we look at the non-precision approach, they've got some language in here, and it basically says the non-precision approach. One of them is going to include basically a full approach with a course reversal. Can either be done on a TAA route if you're doing a GPS one, or holding in lieu or something like that. The applicant does have to accomplish the procedure from an initial approach fix without the use of an autopilot. Okay, so you're going to end up hand flying one of these precision approaches, and to make it even more fun, the applicant must fly one of these approaches with reference to backup or partial panel instrumentation or navigation display. So you're going to have a partial panel, non-precision, full approach on pretty much every practical test we do, because you're going to hand fly it. So this is kind of the worst of the worst for that CFII and instrument candidate, right? So expect one of those approaches to be a non autopilot driven. You're going to do that partial panel one. It might be a PFD display. It might be a vacuum failure, depending on what you've got in terms of systems in your aircraft. That's going to be one of those approaches that you're going to do. And the way the language at the end of the ACS and PTS box us in, that's going to be all kind of on the same approach. So a good thing just to be prepared for as well.
So let's just dive into full approach briefly. What if I have an approach that starts at an IAF, doesn't have a course reversal, doesn't have any type of hold? Can I do that? Does that count as a full approach?
So a full approach with a course reversal, and this is where the examiner is going to have to do a little bit of selection, is generally considered a TAA route or something that includes a 90 or greater degree change to get on the final course. So if we have a fully straight in, the guidance we've been given as examiners is that's not a full approach. We need something with a course reversal, and generally that's 90 degrees or greater of turn. So a standard T-bar GPS approach would count, but one that kind of approached at maybe like a little angle isn't going to quite get us there. So now what we could do, though, is assign a hold in the middle of that for the course reversal to get on course as well.
Excellent.
Certainly, if that's published in there, that'd be an option too.
All right, good. Thanks for clarifying that.
So one other thing that I think is really important is in the commercial, and there's been a lot of rumor about this over the years. We've had some guidance to us as examiners, but now that guidance is fully viewable to everybody. When we look at the operational requirements, limitations, and task information under Appendix 3 in the Commercial Aircraft Equipment Operational Requirements Limitations, we have some notes about that power off 180-degree landing now. And one of the notes says, initiating a go-around as a result of the applicant's inability to complete the task within the tolerances specified in the skill elements is considered unsatisfactory. So it goes on a little bit, if there's a clause here that says, look, if it's runway safety concerns, if somebody pulls it on the runway, tower says we need you to go around, there's a deer, something like that, you can go around. But basically, this is a no-go-around maneuver, and this is codified in the new commercial ACS. We've had guidance on this in the past. Most of us have kind of known it in the training community, but it is officially in that ACS at this point. So expect that power off 180 to be a one-try maneuver, and you're going to have to hit that spot. So it's there for good now. I guess, Max, for all of us that fly in, Cirrus is another ballistic parachute-equipped aircraft. Another note, too, is that the applicants must follow the manufacturer's procedures for arming and disabling the system prior to flight, teaching an applicant's knowledge regarding how to and when to use the system and associated risks. So, we've had some cases where examiners were saying, look, I know you got a ballistic chute, but I want you to show me how you would do this emergency as if you didn't have one. Well, that's in contradiction to the manufacturer's recommendation for an airplane. So what they're asking here is, look, if you're equipped, do your emergencies how the manufacturer says. So be prepared to know about that system, and your examiners should be asking it that way as well. So there's a few of the big highlights, Max. There's nothing really big changing in terms of how we do things, but a couple of minutia things kind of help how we administrate that test and maybe how you're going to be able to, as an applicant or a CFI, work to prepare for these with a little bit more modernization of the systems that are in the aircraft and making sure we're doing it the modern way, not just how we did it in the 1940s. So really these ACSs and PTSs were updates for modernization. There's some language changes in them. But the good news is the maneuvers you were doing before are still the maneuvers you're going to be doing now. The standards haven't changed. And if you've been training up until now and you're going to test after May 31st, there's not a lot going to change in how you're going to test. So if you're prepared and we're switching to the new ACS because you didn't quite get that Checkride in time, don't worry too much. You're going to be okay yet.
Good to know. Yeah, fascinating that they're talking about the parachute. Those are certainly now being used by a number of different manufacturers. So Cirrus is traditionally associated with it. I like the part where that says not actual deployment of the system. So
I do too. I would very much appreciate that on Checkride if we don't actually pull the unhappy lever.
And so if I were doing a private Checkride and they've pulled the power and said, now what are you going to do? Would it be acceptable to say, hey, the manufacturer says I should pull the parachute?
I think it's good if, depending on the altitude, right? So one of the common things we see in the Cirrus is the manufacturer recommends making a decision to use the parachute no lower than 2,000 feet, if possible. We certainly have lower altitudes they may be deployable at, but let's imagine them cruising along at 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 feet. I would hope the applicant would say, look, I'm going to first go through an emergency checklist. Maybe we'll check mags, we'll check fuel, kind of work through these things. If I've exhausted my options, and I've got to do something, if there's an airport there, I would think it's reasonable to say, look, I'll go land at the airport. And if I'm over trees or over water or over a 2-lane country road with power lines, that's a perfectly reasonable spot that say, look, I don't have a great way to guide myself down here. let's go to the parachute and secure ourselves. And then walking through that securing process too. And I think that's actually an important piece that a lot of people forget about when they, we're going to go to that parachute. It's not just sit there and hope. I mean, you're going to position yourself, make sure your seatbelts are on good and tight, make sure you got your hands positioned in a way that the airbags aren't going to hit them. We do have other guidance on this, and this is something a good PIC, especially somebody who's going to be a commercial pilot, would pass along to their their passengers as well. So, that's part of the system here, knowing how to work with that system and really make it the most effective if you ever need it. Hopefully, nobody listening to this ever needs it.
Now, what I really like about this is that examiners can't choose to just say, pretend there's no parachute in this airplane. They have to acknowledge that it's actually part of the equipment that pilots are supposed to learn how to use.
I agree wholeheartedly. We should be testing that and asking it too, because it really does save people when there's not better options for landing.
Tell us, where can people find out more about you and read your blog?
I'm pretty easy to find. Just go to jasonblair.net, and there's all kinds of stuff there. And if you got check rides coming up, don't be afraid to look at some of the articles and stuff there. Most of the things I write about are things we see in daily flying and during the practical tests. So it's not cheating if you learn it ahead. We're just glad to help share stuff.
You can find out more about Jason and his books at jasonblair.net. And if you live near Michigan, you may want to schedule a check ride with him. In our show notes, you'll find links to Jason's website, his page for scheduling a check ride, and his YouTube channel. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your side's maybe sliding upside down.